I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. This week, a special treat for you guys. A conversation with my friend and colleague Mark Doyle on his new book, John Cale's Paris 1919. It's a contribution to the 33 1/3 series, which is a great series of books on albums. Also, this is episode number 333. How could that be any better? I was geeked out about that when I realized it. Wasn't on purpose, but if you want to think we're that clever, we'll let you hold on to it. You may remember Mark from our conversation about the Kinks a few years ago. Mark invited me to host a conversation at Middle Tennessee State University's Center for Popular Music, and it went so great that we decided to air it on the feed. And I got to tell you guys, I like music history. It's not my thing. But when Mark Doyle writes a book about music history, it's good. If you're interested in music history, I would say check this out. It's such a fun book. It's rooted in history, but then he goes off on, asking questions like, is John Cale's Paris 1919 a Christmas album? Which is honestly a blast. It's still kind of mind-blowing that you could even make it that. For you guys who aren't familiar with John Cale, and that may be a lot of you, he was one of the founding members of Velvet Underground and was thrown out of the band by Lou Reed in 1968. And since then, for over half a century, has made all of these incredible contributions to music that I feel like are really unsung. And so this gets into the history of Velvet Underground, the history of, the moment that this album, Paris 1919, comes out in 1973. Questions of why Cale is just making noise in the background in Velvet Underground and suddenly puts out this beautiful, polished album. Such a great conversation. So one thing up front I should say is that this wasn't really recorded to be a podcast. The format's great, but you get some noise in the background. Apologies for that. We couldn't really take that out since it wasn't done in a studio. I will say here, though, shout out to Greg Reich and Martin Fisher at MTSU Center for Popular Music for recording this and then being kind enough to share this with us to air on the Road to Now's feed. Before we go, I don't know if you guys heard Bob on Michael Smerconish on Thursday, but he crushed it. Shout out to any new listeners that might be over here from that. Live show, May 29th, Road to Now Live, Tales of Murder and Mayhem, coming up in Washington, D.C. at the Hamilton Live. Still got tickets available. You can go to rtmpod.me/listen to get those, or there's a link in the episode description if you're listening on a podcast player. Finally, thank you to the patrons. You guys keep the show going. If you want to check out what we're doing, patreon.com/theroadtonow. I hope you're all having a great week, and I hope you enjoy not only a great conversation, but maybe a break from the intensity of the pace of the show lately and the pace of America. We'll be back at it soon. Stay strong. Thanks for listening.
Mark Doyle and Ben Sawyer.
Thank you. Well, since I have the honor of being the interviewer here, I'll go ahead and just start off. Mark, could you tell us about John Cale? He has so much influence on modern musicians that maybe people are more familiar with. If you could talk about his life, his influences on modern music, and where this album, Paris 1919, fits within the big picture of his career.
Sure. So when I've told people over the last couple of years that I was working on this book, and I say, I'm working on this book about an album by John Cale, mostly what I would get is blank stares. So I'm curious, how many of you in the room have heard of Cale? Okay, exactly the people I expected. Velvet Underground? A few more. So Cale was a member of the Velvet Underground in the 1960s with Lou Reed and a couple of others, affiliated with Andy Warhol, and set the template for a certain kind of rock that hadn't been heard before, a kind of artistic, avant-garde, rather angry form of rock music that went on to influence countless people. Cale himself is from Wales. He moved to the United States in 1963 on a music scholarship. He classically trained back in Britain, and hooked up with Lou Reed in the middle of the 60s and formed this band, which at the time nobody really knew much about, but over time became very transformative. Lou Reed, he was not the best human resources manager. He had fractious relationships with Cale and Warhol and other people affiliated with the band. He kicked Cale out of the band in 1968, mostly because they weren't being commercially successful. Cale then went on to this solo career, which has lasted to this very day. I saw him just a few weeks ago in London, and he's 83 and still going strong. He was going stronger than I was. I was ready to conk out about 10:30, and he kept going. So this album came out about 5 years after the Velvet Underground. Also, after he left the Velvet Underground, 1973. Also didn't gain a lot of attention. Those people who heard it couldn't say enough wonderful things about it, and it has itself gone on to be very influential. So you asked about people who Cale had influenced. Iggy and the Stooges, he produced their first album. Patti Smith produced Horses, their famous 75 album, which is just going through its like 50th anniversary events at the moment. Worked with Nico, Jonathan Richman, Nick Drake. He introduced Nick Drake to the 12-string guitar. He's one of these people he's not been in the background. He's been fairly prominent. He's had his own solo career and fairly prominent in various Velvet Underground-related events and reunions and so on. But his influence is probably as great behind the scenes as it has been in front of the scenes, if that makes sense.
So I think it'll be good to give more about that kind of the general story before we talk about the themes of your book, which I think really are what hold it together and make it really strong. I thought one of the funny stories here is that Cale and Reed, they're both known as like these avant-garde figures, as these groundbreaking figures, but they met through the Primitives, this group that was put together, which is not at all where you'd expect these two people to meet each other. Could you tell that story and how it shapes their relationship?
Yeah, Lou Reed, the songwriter of the Velvet Underground, widely hailed these days as one of the great songwriters of the 20th century. You have to make a living as a songwriter, and the way he was making a living in the middle of the 60s in New York was working for this outfit that was kind of churning out prefabricated, made-to-order singles, copies of popular sounds that were, kind of thrown together. They weren't especially innovative or interesting, but the idea was just to sort of churn out enough product that something would catch, or they'd just sell enough copies to keep the money flowing in. And at a certain point, the company decided to form a band out of this kind of studio concoction. And Lou Reed was moving in the same downtown artistic circles as John Cale and some other members of Andy Warhol's circle, and they all just kind of came together, recorded and had a few live shows. Didn't really go anywhere, but that was kind of the moment when these two guys met each other, and the sparks flew, I guess. And then from there, they formed the Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground doesn't really do much until Andy Warhol sees them. Actually, one of his collaborators sees them and then invites Warhol in to see them perform live in Manhattan. And they become kind of the house band of Andy Warhol's studio, the factory, where all sorts of crazy, wild things went on that I don't get into in this book. There's plenty of books about the Velvet Underground, and my book is kind of post-Velvets. But one of the defining features of the Velvet Underground was they made music that was in some ways radio friendly, in some ways kind of influenced by Lou Reed's interest in doo-wop and early rock and roll. But Cale brought this avant-garde sensibility to it, adding screeches and drones and strange repetitions. Cale had worked with people like John Cage and others before joining the Velvet Underground, and was really influenced by these very kind of outlandish modernist theories about sound and music. And so he brings that avant-garde sensibility to the Velvet Underground, and they create something that really hadn't been heard before, and as I say, is tremendously influential. What's interesting about this album, though, the 1973 album that I'm writing about in this Paris 1919, is it sounds nothing like the Velvet Underground. It's pretty, it's lush, it's heavily orchestrated. There aren't really any obvious avant-garde markers, although if you dig deep enough, you can find a few. And so one of the things I wanted to kind of figure out in this book was how do you get from the Velvet Underground, especially those first two albums that Cale played on, some of which is, if you listen to the second album, White Light, White Heat, it's almost unlistenable in portions, like if you're not prepared for it. It's improvised. The Sister Ray is, 20, 22 minutes long, and it just sort of goes on, and it's been very influential, but it's not radio-friendly, not listener-friendly. You have to spend quite a bit of time with it. So to go from that to these lush orchestrations and historical reference points and a sort of a mood of European sophistication 5 years later it was sort of one of the mysteries I was trying to solve.
I think it's interesting because it's almost like the way they were formed is like if two members of NSYNC broke off from the band and then changed the world. You know what I'm saying? Like you'd be like, I didn't see that coming. That's we put them together to make money,
Could still happen.
Yeah. you talk about these three big influences on Cale's work, and Reed is one of them, Warhol's another one, and then Nico. Let's start with Lou Reed, because you just talked about this. Reed throws him out of the band, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that he can't produce commercially viable music. And you say, though, that one of the biggest influences that Reed has on him is that he teaches him how to write rock songs, teaches him how to write songs that have a format to them. Reed throws him out because he's not writing commercially viable songs, and then Cale moves to Los Angeles and writes commercially viable songs. What do you think happened there? Like, why do you think he didn't turn towards that when it felt like there could be something maybe kept together with the Velvet Underground?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Lou Reed is a topic that I get into a little bit, but he has many biographies, and there's a lot to say about Reed. But he was really a force of nature in a certain sense. He was churning out these songs that were really innovative, really catchy in certain ways, really transgressive in other ways, talking about themes that you weren't really supposed to talk about, sadomasochism and drug use very openly, and very sort of gritty stuff. And so I think Cale's role in the Velvets, and he was happy to take sort of a back seat and just to act as the arranger. Like he deals with the sounds that we're going to throw in, the instrumentation, the general sort of mood or theme or vibe of the band. And then when he leaves the band, I don't know. I think Cale tries several things after he leaves the Velvets. He tries to write and releases a fairly straight up rock album called Vintage Violence, which sounds like the band. You know the band? The band with a capital B. You know this band? I mean, it was heavily influenced by them and by some other elements of what was going on in American rock around 1970. He tries to do an avant-garde, he does an avant-garde collaboration with minimalist composer Terry Riley, which is kind of jazz improvisation, although there's a nice little pop song stuck in the middle of that album. He goes to London and works with the London Symphony Orchestra. His own training is classical, and so he wants to orchestrate try his hand at writing an orchestra and being a composer, although on that album too he throws in some rock songs or pop songs. And I think, and along the way he's working with Nico and the Stooges and so on. I think you get the sense with Cale that he kind of never really set out to be a rock and roll star. That wasn't his natural path. Like he would have been quite happy to be a John Cage or somebody like that who is working at the fringes of the avant-garde, testing the boundaries of what you can do with instrumentation and sound. But I had to make a living, I guess, as part of it. Not that he made a whole lot of living from his records, but he made some. And the Reed influence was... Well, I think what Lou Reed showed him was that you could be an intellectual and make rock and roll music, which was not something that most people would have thought, except maybe Dylan around the same time. But that wasn't really how people understood rock music or popular music in the middle of the 60s. So I think Cale probably was able to reconcile himself to the fact that, I guess I am a rock musician, but I can still be this intellectual. But I think one of the reasons that Cale is not as well known as Reed is because his career since the Velvets has been really all over the place. He's done the classical stuff, he's done the experimental stuff, he's done soundtrack work, he's done pop music, rock music. It's hard to kind of put him into a box and say this is what he does, therefore, in a way that you can actually with Lou Reed. So I think that's maybe why he's harder to pin down and less well known.
Yeah, I think so. I honestly wondered, I don't know, maybe this is just my spirit, like he leaves and he starts doing, he does all kinds of things, but kind of his early things are to produce albums that are coherent. Paris 1919 is a coherent rock album, like it fits within the genre. And I just wondered how much of that was like a chip on his shoulder, like showing the world.
Try to outdo
I was thrown out
Lou
because I
Reed.
couldn't do it, but I can do it.
It could well be, yeah. His relationship with Reed after the Velvets was interesting. Like Lou Reed died in 2013, but until then they kind of continued bouncing off of each other throughout their careers. They would collaborate for a time, and then they'd be alienated from one another. Reed was always in interviews, every interview I've seen with Reed, he's always tremendously complimentary of Cale. He's a musical genius. Reed gave one interview where he said, in like 1975, 76, he said, when John finally gets around to making the album that he was born to make, he's going to blow everybody away with what he is capable of. And I think he actually had already already done that in Paris, 1973. But like, so they were always and Cale was always complimentary toward Reed, but it was a tense. Lou Reed did not play well with others. I think that's largely what it comes down to.
No, it's interesting, Mark, because he says, he's like, one day he'll make a good album.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, he's put out several albums. He's like, I guess he'll get there someday.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes I read this. I'm from the country, you know. People think differently. They've probably been in Wales, where he's from.
Nah, I don't know.
So let's get into the themes of it, because what runs through this is the theme of ghosts, right? You tell it as a ghost story. In fact, we were in the car, and my son, who's 10, was like, why do you keep carrying this book around with you? And I was like, well, because I'm reading it. Also, it's really easy to carry around. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's small. It fits in your back pocket.
Yes.
And I was like, well, it's Mark Doyle. He's like a friend of ours. And I was like, well, why don't you pick it up and read it? And he read the first page, and you could tell he was kind of scared. Like, he's like, whoa, this is a book about ghosts. But it is in this beautiful way. And what you talk about are, you know, you've got the chapter breakdown, right? You've got all of which are themed by ghosts. And in this story, it's a story of a guy who's picking up these ghosts as he moves along. And to me, what struck me was that the ghosts really are what we carry from the past with us when we move on places. And then the past and the place that we go. We are haunted by our own personal ghosts, and then we move to a space that is haunted by everyone who was ever there. And we live in that world. And it's kind of chaotic, but you can't really exorcise those ghosts. They're part of your life. And when you talk about the influences, you know, Reed, which, you know, everyone wants to talk about because he's very famous, right? Warhol, you say he taught him work ethic and, you know, how to run from nostalgia. And then you talk about Nico. And to me, this seems like, from your book, the ghost that haunts him the most. And it's got to be. It's like love lost. It's like brilliant collaboration, losing so much, but still carrying that with him. And I was wondering if you could talk about her. You know, tell her story, because I feel like she's lesser known, and then how that relationship carries on with him. Because, you know, Mark and I were talking about this earlier. When you have friendships with people, they form you, they make you who you are, and frequently you move on. The person hasn't passed. You move on and you become different people, and the ghost of that person who's still alive from that moment goes with you. And I think that seems to be what happens with Nico.
Yeah, so I mean, first thing to say is that the ghost thing was just partly a strategic thing on my part, because you need a hook for a book like this. 33 1/3, they put out these calls for public submissions every 3 months, 4 months, maybe it might be every year. Anyway, they periodically put out these calls. Hundreds, thousands of people. Anybody who's a major music fan and knows about the series has their like ideal album that they would love to write a book about, right? And so they all write in. So you need something that makes you stand out. The ghost thing occurred to me because the title track of the song, the title track of the album, the song called Paris 1919, has a refrain that goes, "You're a ghost, la 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 la," although it's rather a little bit more melodic than I made it just then. And so it's an image that sort of sticks in your head if you listen to the album for any length of time, and I've been listening to it for a long time. So that seemed like a good way to structure the book in terms of talking about Cale's influences, Lou Reed, Andy Warhol, Nico. Later I talk about Dylan Thomas and others. But also, as you're saying, to talk about the way that if you listen to the album, it does have this sort of haunting feeling to it. It has a kind of sepia-toned, hazy, one person recently I heard describe it as a kind of a watercolor feel to it. Like it sort of, every song sort of bleeds into another one, and there's a lot going on below the surface that's not really evident if you just pay it surface level attention. And so it also became a way to talk about actual ghosts and as you're saying, the people who we leave behind as we progress through life and how they stick with us, or a certain version of them sticks with us. So, Nico. Anybody sat down and listened to a Nico album here in the last year? Just sat down and listened to it?
That's nobody.
That's
you guys
nobody.
ever listened.
Yeah. Who's heard of Nico? Same people as heard of Cale. Good.
There's a demographic.
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
Older. You guys are listening.
I'm glad you're noticing that pattern. So Nico was the stage name of this woman, Krista. I don't know how to say the last name, Pafjin. She's a German model. She came over to the States, and Andy Warhol, one of the things Andy Warhol did was he made pretty women famous. He had his gang of superstars. Edie Sedgwick was probably the most famous, but Nico's another one. And so he kind of foisted her onto the Velvet Underground, who by this point he was managing, and had her sing some songs. And she had this very deep kind of Teutonic, one reviewer called it a voice from the far side of death. It's a fairly distinctive sound. And Cale and Nico had a brief fling. Lou Reed and Nico had a brief fling. Nico had lots of flings, as did Cale and Reed for that matter. But the connection between Cale and Nico remained after he left the band. He produced several of her albums afterwards. And if you do get a chance, someday when it's cold and gloomy outside, or just cold and gloomy in your soul, you read the news and you're like ready to just sort of curl up into a ball, put on a Nico album and it'll make you feel much worse. But then you'll climb out of it and you'll feel much better. The Marble Index, 1970, I think, is her first significant collaboration with Cale. And it has this kind of tundra quality to it. It's windswept and kind of icy and cold. But what makes it's unlike anything that has been recorded ever since or even before. It's sort of her voice is sort of deep, growly, and she's playing an harmonium. And then Cale in the background playing whatever he could find, maracas or nautical whistles or tambourines or jingle bells, whatever, to create this kind of, I think I call it in the book, almost like a haunted carnival kind of sound to it. And those sounds that Cale was creating, along with Nico's voice, made something that, not just on that album, but a few subsequent ones as well, are perfect for when you're in a certain kind of mood. I remember while I was researching this book, I was trying to teach a night class, taught a night class that semester at MTSU, done at 9 o'clock, and I live in Nashville, so it's a long drive down I-24. And Nico has an album called The End, in which she covers the Doors song, The End. Do you know this one? Yes, this is the end, my only friend. Imagine that, but like 10 times creepier, and Nico singing it. And I'm driving down 24. It's dark, I'm tired, And I think on 2 separate occasions on this drive down 24, I saw cars in flame on the side of the road. And I was like, that's perfect.
You did it.
Yeah, I need to get off this road. I'm causing this chaos. So Nico's somebody who, through her voice, through her sort of whole affect and her lack of affect, her vibe, and her history with Cale has kind of stuck with him throughout. So a couple of years ago, he put out an album called Mercy, in which there's a song called, I forget it's like Moonlighting, but the subtitle is Nico's Ghost. He's still trying to sort of work out what it meant to be involved with this woman creatively over the years. She died, she had a sort of tragic life throughout the 70s and 80s, I think in the 90s when she died. A heroin addict, all sorts of trouble with kind of getting through the day and family troubles and so on. But she died, of all things, of a bicycle accident in Spain. She was hit by a car. So she's definitely worth knowing more about. I believe there was a recent new documentary about her. I can't tell you the name, but she's a fascinating person.
I think one of the because you read this book, and if you're into the story because you're interested in Cale or you're interested in music, you'll approach it and you'll get what you want. But you also you trick people into learning about history. One chapter is the ghost of history, right? Yep. I mean, so you're transparent, but that's also like chapter 3. You got to get there, right? Before that, though, you tell some fascinating stories that really. One of the things I love about your work, Mark, is that when you describe a place, I can almost see it. This was true with your Kinks book. This is true with talking about New York and Los Angeles. And to be fair, you gave less space to that in this book. Nevertheless, it was really fascinating. So, one of the things that happens after Cale leaves Velvet Underground is he moves to Los Angeles, kind of bizarrely takes a job as an A&R at a major record label. But you talk about what New York was at the time and then what Los Angeles is at the time. And I think for anybody who's interested in just music, the music industry, music history, this is kind of a fascinating juxtaposition. And then just I never realized all the themes that are coming together in Los Angeles at this point. So could you talk about that? Because you do say, I wrote this down, a quote, that Los Angeles was quote, not a Velvet's kind of town.
Yeah.
Yet he thrives there. So could you just describe these places?
Sure. Yeah, so the Velvets are very much associated with New York, specifically downtown New York. Kind of the arty, turtleneck wearing, heroin taking, kind of sarcastic and sort of unemotional and very, very cool New York. LA in the 60s and early 70s was hippies, surfers. Laurel Canyon, the singer-songwriter scene is really booming in the 70s, so people like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and Jackson Browne and so on. The Velvets had gone to LA in 1966, I believe, and had hated it. It was not their kind of place. They didn't get along with the crowds. The police shut them down at a certain point. And so it was weird that Cale ended up in LA. The thing that brought him to LA was this job that he got thanks to the influence of his friend Joe Boyd, who was actually here at MTSU a few months ago, talking about his new book on global music, which I highly recommend. Boyd was a record producer. He knew Cale in London, got a job at Warner Brothers, brought Cale over, and Cale had a 9-to-5 job working at Warner Brothers. So he comes to this place that is steeped in, is the headquarters of many of the record companies of the day. Motown actually moves from Detroit to LA around this time. And it's where all the studios are. It's where the session musicians are. It's this real kind of hotbed of American culture, not just musically, but in terms of Hollywood, of course, and television. And it's part of this kind of general trend of population shift from the East Coast to the West as people seek out the sunny climes of the Southwest. So it's a hard place to imagine this kind of stern, sophisticated, New York hardened Welshman wandering around LA. It's not really his scene. And it does sound like he kind of moves through LA like a bit of a ghost. I talked to people who were in LA at the time, and who were part of the music scene, and legendary clubs, legendary kind of groupie scene, and hotels, and there's a million stories of LA in the early 70s. And I would ask, do you remember anything about John Cale? And no, not really. He wasn't really evident. And he wasn't there terribly long. He didn't like it all that much. I think he lives there today now. Like something about it appeals to him.
Maybe that it's like 75 degrees and sunny every day. Mark, that could be it.
Could be, yeah.
I love Los Angeles.
Yeah, there might be the restaurant scene. I mean, obviously, yeah, there's a lot to love about LA, but he didn't like it. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I try to say in the book is he's bringing the ghosts of New York with him to LA, and he's recording this album, which doesn't sound like it's made in LA, although it is. It doesn't, and uses LA musicians, session musicians and band members, or people who are in other LA bands to play it on it. But it's not typically, this album, Paris 1919, is not typically classed as a Los Angeles album or one of the great albums of this era in LA history, but it is. It is.
It strikes me that it was interesting because, there's this idea that Los Angeles has there's a vision to Los Angeles, but what it is kind of amorphous. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Los Angeles Looks at Itself.
No.
It traces the way Los Angeles is depicted in films, from early on through, and it makes the sense that it's just kind of an amorphous canvas. It doesn't really give it the credit for what it is. So, I don't know, when I think about the music sound of what, an LA music sound of that time, I think it's hard to imagine what that means, at least for me. But yeah. I'm also not a music historian. A casual observer, when they look at your work, would say, well, this is Mark Doyle's second book about music history. But as I was reading this, having read the Kinks book, which is also fantastic, it's a fundamentally different thing. And I wonder how difficult it was, because the Kinks book is a book about a band, and Paris 1919 is a book about an album. And I wonder, if somebody were you write about music history, was your approach to those two different projects different because of that? And how much more was it a challenge, or how much easier was it to move from one to the other, or did it present challenges you didn't expect?
That's a good question. I think it was actually fairly similar. The Kinks book, so this is a book that I wrote about the British band, the Kinks. It came out about 5 years ago, about the songwriting of the main songwriter of the band, Ray Davies. And the Kinks book's kind of divided up into chapters about specific albums, and that had actually begun as a the Kinks book began as a proposal for the 33 1/3 series. I was going to fictionalize one of the Kinks albums and make it into a novel, and they didn't want that, so I turned it into something else. So no, I mean, one of the nice things about, I don't know if it's a nice thing, it's just one of the peculiarities of being a historian is that any excuse to do a deep dive into one single thing and to see all the different strands that you can pull in and all the different things that it touches, it's kind of irresistible. And so no, I mean, it was lots of listening to music. It was I lucked out. One of the things you want as a historian is an archivist who will gladly hand over all sorts of documents to you. And knows where the documents are and will save you time by sort of going in and finding the documents that you need. That rarely happens in the real world. But in this case, I lucked out by getting into contact with this woman up in Massachusetts who is doing some sort of John Cale archiving project. Like, I don't know if it's for Cale or an independent project, but she has newspaper clippings, magazine clippings, any interview he ever gave, any review of any of his albums or shows that had ever happened, not just in the United States or Britain, but around the world. She had them all digitized, and she put them on her website and said, here, you can just use them. And I said, this is going to make me look really smart. And so the research for this was actually fairly quick and easy because I had this immediate access to all these reviews and so on of the album and other things. I mean, I still had to go through it and I had to analyze it and do all that stuff, but I didn't have to do the legwork of actually tracking it down as much. So that part was probably easier than the Kinks.
But what was harder when you read the book, and you would, when Mark told me he had this book out, I went to listen to the album, and there was a re-release, like an updated re-release that came out in 2024. And my first thought was, oh, this is all part of a greater project, right? Get Cale's name out there, right? Get this new, this new remastered issue out there. And then you find out that Cale wouldn't talk to Mark for the book. Like, he tried to get at him, but he couldn't. And I think, as historians, you're used to writing about people who are dead. What you're not used to writing about is people who are alive. And then you have this kind of interesting situation where you try to get at the guy and he doesn't manifest. The interview doesn't manifest. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk about that. And when I read this book, my first thought is, man, it's disappointing that he couldn't talk to Cale. Until I read the book and I go, actually, this is a fantastic book. I almost wonder, if that would have changed anything. So how did you go about that process without being able to talk to them?
Yeah, so you don't just sort of email these people, right? You have to go through their people, their manager. So I had the contact info of the manager. I emailed several times, didn't hear anything back. And I had been told that the manager can be a little protective. And so I didn't push it too much. I think it would have enhanced my credibility as a writer if I were able to talk to him, I suppose. But it also would have, possibly, if I'd been able to talk to him, would actually maybe have negatively affected the book because in this book, so I kind of I start pretty grounded in the history of the actual album, but then I go off in all sorts of different directions. I talk about Dylan Thomas, I talk about history, I talk about Dada and surrealism, I make a big argument in the last chapter that this is actually a great unrecognized Christmas album, which it's not, but I make the argument anyway. And I think I would have felt less free to do that if I had talked to Cale, because I would be more inclined to give his version of events more weight than maybe they should have. Because one of the big points I make in this book, try to get across, is that art is an art object is whatever we bring to it, right? We bring our own sets of ghosts and preconceptions and preoccupations to a work of art, and to a certain extent, the artist's intent doesn't matter. That's a whole ball of wax. But art is sort of this collaboration between the audience and the art itself. And so to have Cale kind of come in and these guys, these old rock and roll guys and gals, they've been interviewed about this stuff a million times. They have their sort of story about, like, this is what happened. Here's the anecdote that I tell when I'm talking about the making of this album. They have their kind of calcified, solidified official version that they just sort of repeat. So I don't think I would have learned anything that I couldn't learn from reading old interviews with him, for one thing. I think I would have been less inclined to trust my own instincts and my own sort of weird proclivities if I had talked to him. And I also would have been scared as hell. I don't know Cale's is sort of intimidating. He's a really tall guy, and he's Welsh, and he's, is really brilliant, sort of intellectual. And I think I would just sort of spend the whole time being like, "You're so awesome. Why are you awesome?"
Chris Farley show.
Exactly. Yeah. And then by the time I got around to asking my questions, our time would be done. So it would have been cool to meet him. Maybe I open up my inbox every morning, and I kind of dread seeing from John Cale. Subject, your book stinks. It could still happen. Actually, that would be cool. I'd post about it. But
get into a beef with him in public. You know what I'm saying?
That's right. It would help us both. But he did. I mean, it was weird because they did just reissue this album. It's like an $80-something box set in vinyl, which if the royalties ever come in, I might be able to afford. And that was in November. My book came out in February, and it sort of would have made sense for us to maybe work together, but it's fine.
But this is what's fascinating to me about it, Mark, is that the reason that people generally have these kind of packaged stories that they tell people is because they want to control the narrative.
Yeah.
They want to control their story.
Yeah.
And sure, it's out there. That's from your perspective. It's out there. But the fact that, you've got to know that if this guy is really worried about curating his image, then he talks to you. Mm-hmm. If only to tell that story to you so that he can rein you in. Mm-hmm. I told Mark Doyle this, and he took liberty with it.
Right.
The fact that he has just the idea that his manager can do this, which probably is from an order from him. What does that tell you about his attempt to leave some kind of a legacy, that he would just let you write this book, knowing that you contacted them about it, right? About a book that is one of his most significant works. What do you think that tells you about Cale as a figure? I
think he doesn't care. The old stuff is old, it's done. He is an artist who, if you ask him, I don't know this firsthand, but I'm told, if you ask him which of your albums is your favorite, he will say the next one. This is one of the things that I admire about him. Even, as I said, he's at the age of 83. I saw him performing in London several weeks ago. And he had totally reworked one of the songs on this album. He made it into sort of this pop punk kind of thing that it's totally unrecognizable. He's continually sort of exploring, reaching for new ideas. He's really into hip hop style production these days, which is very different than what he used to be into. And so, I think like a lot of artists who are explorers and who are not content to just sort of do the same thing over and over, when a project is done, it's done. The response can be whatever it can be, and you move on to the next thing. And so he's not terribly interested in revisiting the past. He'll appear in a Velvet Underground documentary from time to time. He'll talk to an interviewer about his career from time to time. But really what he's interested in is what's coming next. And so, in my email to his manager, I was like, now listen, I know he doesn't like talking about the old stuff. Here's some new questions that I might ask him about the old stuff that you might be, but whatever, they didn't go anywhere. So I don't think he's, it's interesting because I do think he must be conscious that he is less of a household name than Lou Reed is, or the Velvet Underground. He must be aware that he has, contributed an awful lot. I think he's one of the principal, actually, architects of rock music for the second half of the 20th century. He's one of the key, shapers of the sound of modern music in lots of ways. He must be aware of that and aware that he is not as well known for it as maybe he should be, but he doesn't, I don't know, he doesn't, maybe it does bother him. I don't want to psychologize, but it doesn't bother his manager, I suppose.
Well, I think it's kind of beautiful, honestly. I think the idea that one could leave behind a legacy that one is secure in having shaped the world and doesn't need everyone to say it. Mm. There's something beautiful, very secure in that. Of course, I'm psychologizing again too, but we all leave behind legacies. Eventually, Nika was more famous than he was, and you've never heard of her. So, things are fleeting, but the influence you leave behind is not. I want to ask you a couple of questions. We're going to get to some Q&A here in a minute, but I want to ask you some questions about your writing. Because for those of you guys right here, most of you guys aren't professors, but you should know that when you go through academic training, it frequently beats the spirit out of you, and you are left writing in a way that you're psychotic about, but just to make sure that it's something that nobody will want to read. And it's just, it's a professional discourse. It's something we have to deal with, and something that we often, I can tell you this, struggle with coming out of. You know, it's like this form, it's like coming out of a childhood where you're like always marked by it. But Mark, you've done it beautifully. And you write poetry, you've written fiction. You're a fantastic writer in spite of all of that. And one of the things that I think is fantastic about this is that you're writing a book as someone who you would presume the people that go to read your book likely they don't know you. And this is their first introduction to you. And yet you open the book with a personal story, right? Which sometimes you're like, why would I go into this person's story? I just heard about this person.
Right.
But it's fantastic. Your book comes out of this personal experience. You make it clear that you're not trying to document the official history of this, that you're telling the story as you see it through these different lenses, that it almost is an act of art in a way that you fight with because you're a historian and I love it. But how did you go about taking this personal experience and turning it into something that by page 4, page 5, when they're short pages, like I'm into it. How did you do that?
God, I wish I knew.
Please tell me, please God.
Yes.
Please let me know.
I'm always surprised when I talk to students, we talk about writing papers and so on, and that somebody will raise their hand and say, can I use the first person in this? Yes. And then I ask, how many of you guys were taught that you should not use the first person in a formal paper? It's, okay, not as many, but like a few. And I say, it's fine. You are the one writing this. You are the one making the argument. You should take ownership of what you're trying to put together. You can say I. You don't want to make it only about yourself or your feelings or whatever. But instead of going for the awkward construction, in this paper it will be argued that, just say, in this paper I will argue. The more direct, the better. And so, I don't know, I guess, so the personal story I open with, in the unlikely event you haven't read the book, is basically when I first heard the album, I didn't like it. It was recommended to me, not just me, but thousands of other people, in an email newsletter from this super hip downtown New York record shop called Other Music, which sadly closed about 9 years ago. They send out weekly email newsletter with little audio clips. This is like the early 2000s. Little audio clips you'd click on and you could hear. And then employees of the store and other people who were associated with the store would write these little reviews, paragraph, 2-paragraph reviews of an album. And this album had just been reissued in 2006, a remastered reissue. And this guy who's initials I knew because I trusted him because I read this newsletter and his taste was kind of my taste. His name is Doug Musaruk. He was praising this album to the skies. He was saying, this is the best album of the 1970s. If you like Bell and Sebastian and the Decemberists, which I was really into at that time, this is earlier and superior product. It's probably the best album you will buy all year. It is, and then so I bought it. I was like, this sounds good. Doug likes it. It must be great. And I bought it and I was like, oh. Sort of slide guitar, and it's very 70s sounding, and it's very lush, and it didn't really grab me. It wasn't catchy, and it sure as hell wasn't the Velvet Underground. Like it wasn't, screeching. There was no mention of heroin. There, nobody is getting a drug deal taken care of in downtown New York. Like it was all, waltzes and lakes and strange, surreal images that didn't really add up. We haven't talked about the lyrics yet, but the lyrics are very hard to make sense of. There's all sorts of different stories you can spin out about what the lyrics are. And so I listened to this and I'm like, okay. But I had paid money for it. And when you pay money for a thing, you're not going to just listen to it once and be like, okay, I'm going to click over to this other thing. You pay money for it, you're going to damn well listen to it until it actually hits you or you decided that you wasted your money. So I kept listening to it. I was like, well, he said it was great. It must be great. So I just kept listening to it. And eventually I discovered that it was the album. You have these albums that you put on between other things. Like you don't know what to put on, so you just sort of throw this on as background music and it's just for your default. That's what this was for me. And the more I listened to it, the more I I let the lyrics sink in and I let the melodies kind of work their magic. And after a while, I was like, well, this is probably my favorite album. How did that happen? So that's the story that I talk about. And I think, I don't know, I guess you start by talking about yourself as an anecdote, as a way to gain reader sympathy so that when you go off the deep end at the end of the book and start arguing how this is, despite all appearances, actually a Christmas album, you've built up enough sympathy and sort of goodwill among the readers that they won't immediately throw the book across the room. They'll get to the end of the chapter and then they'll throw the book across the room. That's all I want.
Fully read.
Yes.
Like
Actually, as long as they paid full price for it, I don't really care. No,
That's right.
yeah.
And you can pay double if you want to. You're welcome
That's
to do
right.
that.
That's right.
I think it's funny you're like, there's no heroin references, but like the first track on the second, I guess it says disc here, I don't know what it is just called I Must Not Sniff Cocaine. And the entire track is just him playing like 30 seconds of one of the songs and then clearly doing a huge line of blow.
Yes. One of the big differences between LA and New York, we were talking about New York was a heroin town and LA was a cocaine town. And Cale was on a lot of coke until about 1985. And then he stopped. He had a daughter and it kind of went cold turkey and became a health nut. But for a decade and a half, it was cocaine and champagne. And if you know that, then that makes a certain amount of sense of some of the album. But yeah, we don't need to explore that too much.
He's able to put out a lot of albums not sleeping, I suppose.
Yes, that's right.
That's great. That's great. I love it. Look, you've teased this a couple of times. Okay, obviously, like I'm a historian. I want to get into like the ghost of history, but you've already said like let's talk about the last chapter, Ghost of Christmas, where you make the argument that maybe you believe that it's a Christmas album. And before you talk about it, I want to ask you a question about it.
Okay.
When I know you, so I'm reading this book, and the first 3 chapters, they're brilliant, but I can tell you feel bounded, right? You feel bounded by you need to source things. You feel bounded by you need to go back to like something concrete. And then in chapter 4, The Ghost of Christmas, you just pull the ripcord. And you just go where you want to go with it. Did you feel as free when you wrote that as it seems like you did?
Yes, that was a lot of fun. So the reason, the first track on the album is called A Child's Christmas in Wales. So there's an explicit Christmas reference right at the beginning. It's a reference to Dylan Thomas' story, and I talk a lot about how Dylan Thomas influences the poet, Welsh poet Dylan Thomas influences John Cale. When I was kind of kicking around the idea of writing this book online, a friend of mine at another university is like, "Oh, you should have a chapter arguing that this is a great Christmas album." I was like, "No, but it's not a Christmas." There's like he mentions Christmas in the title of one of the tracks, but doesn't even talk about Christmas in the song itself. It's not a Christmas album. But I had a whole book to write, for one thing. It's a short book, but I had a word count. So I was listening to it, and I was like, there's you can kind of hear sleigh bells on this one track, and there's sort of a reference to religion on this other track, and Christmas is a religious thing. And the more I listened to it, the more I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. Screw it. Let's just make this. Let's just say this is a Christmas album. And so I kind of have a little listener's guide, have some people over, light some candles. I talk about what it was like in Christmas in 1973, which was just after the oil crisis, and there was, energy rationing, oil rationing. It was a very difficult Christmas. Actually, the White House Christmas tree only had one light bulb that year, as a symbolic gesture towards conserving energy. I was Richard Nixon too. So anyway, I just kind of I'm going to go track by track. Most of these 33 and third books have a track by track analysis, right? Song by song. This is what it means. These are the lyrics. And because the lyrics are so strange and surreal, they're so open to interpretation. What I really didn't want to do was just to give the master decoding of the record. This is what it really means. This is what all, the grand unified theory of this record. And so I wanted to sort of encourage people to come up with their own, the most outlandish interpretations they could come up with and just roll with it. Not just with this album, but with any album. And listen to Joni Mitchell's album Blue and imagine that every single track is about a different shade of blue. I don't know, you can go for it. And so, I did a sort of song by song, and I tried to tease out themes having to do with religion and ghosts and the connection between Christmas and ghosts, which is actually very strong in folklore. There probably weren't as many footnotes in there because I was just making it up. And it was fun. And it's the one that the feedback that I've gotten when people email me or talk to me about the album or about the book, people feel it was a very strong duty to tell me that they do not buy this Christmas argument. I'm like, that's great. That's good. You have your own interpretation. That's what this is supposed to encourage.
I feel like it's like telling somebody who's writing a book about Kanye's college dropout and being like, make it about earthquakes. Like, why? You're like, the first track is It All Falls Down. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
early track. And you're like, and then, but it's great. It felt like a little bit like a literary version of putting Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon on, like, over Wizard of Oz.
Yep.
Right? Because it's like, you're like, okay, maybe it wasn't meant to, but it works.
Yeah.
And you were haunted by a ghost in that one, too, because the longest track you cover is Graham Greene. And it was like, a lot of them have like short descriptions, and you go way into that one. And I'm like, Mark loves literature. That's why. That's what I thought anyway.
Yeah, I had that section was much longer. I went really deep on Greene, whom Graham Greene is a writer that Cale is very influenced by, and that I love as well. So yeah, that what you're getting is a distilled version of what I have to say about it.
That's right.
Graham Greene.
Get the extended cut later on. I want to move on to the questions. I've just got a closer for you that goes back to this. You refuse to make claims about what the songs mean, right? You say they're open to interpretation. This should be a canvas, right? And Cale himself has been elusive on the topic. And I feel like a lot of the fun in this book is that, right? If Cale reads the book and calls you and says, I want to do an interview, and I want you to write a second version of this book, do you take the phone call?
Do I have to write the second version? Am I signing a contract?
Like, he calls you and goes, I want to talk.
Okay.
And do you take the call? Would you do it, or would you feel like you lost something? Because I personally, I have my opinion on this. But
I think I would do it because this book is already out and he can't change it. And it would still be nice to, well, I don't know, would it be nice to meet him?
you just said you'd be very
I'd be
scared. If you met him.
yeah. But if it's
he
just a
knows that
phone
now.
call.
He's going to lean into it.
That's true, actually.
He's probably watching this on Facebook.
Right, sort of
and stuff.
leering at me. No, I would, but I would approach him with a certain amount of, not skepticism, but at arm's length, and kind of hear him out, I suppose, but not necessarily swallow everything.
Well, I'm glad this book came out and he didn't talk to you, honestly, because the book is fantastic. And it's Paris 1919. There's a whole section on history there that is the connections between the moment he's living in and what happens at the Treaty of Versailles, and the Dadaism into Surrealism. It's brilliant, more than we could talk about here. Couldn't recommend the book more. Mark, thank you for being here for us.
Well, I think we're out of time, but let's all thank Ben and especially Mark for being here today.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Gary Fletcher, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.